Howdy, guys. Attorney Walter Hnot. Now, we're going to be going into a topic that is scary for a lot of reasons, and I want you to understand what the actual problem is here. The problem is that we're facing political turmoil, which is creating imbalance as to future forecasts as to what will happen with the budget. As you know, Democrats had quasi full control, right? There's some wiggle room with that argument. But now, obviously, the Senate has capacity going Republican, and the Republicans are not going to want to go ahead and have just a runoff budget. Let's go through some of the basics that are happening here so that you have a better understanding as to how you can prepare for it and you understand the major categories of what will actually affect essentially this shutdown if it were to occur. Now, before we go into that, please remember, if this video helps you, if it gives you ideas, if it kind of walks you through the process, please remember to leave 5-star reviews, likes, and subscriptions, right? Go ahead and subscribe, hit that bell. I'm going to put the details for that into the chat section, and then I'm going to go ahead and put the details of that into the content section once the video is done. Now, we need to start with the very beginning because some of you are going to say de facto right off the bat that the government will always fund this potential default situation. And they usually always come through to some degree. To give you kind of a background of this, in 1980, the government was shut down, federal government specifically, for 1 day. 1981, 1 day. 1984, 1 day, approximately 4 hours. 1986, 1 day, approximately 4 hours. 1990, it was shut down for 3 hours. November of 1995, 5 hours. 95 to 96, it was shut down for 21 days. November 1995 was 5 days. 95 to 96, it was 21 days. 2013, it was shut down for 16 days. January 2018, it was shut down for 3 days. 2018 to 2019, it was shut down for essentially 35 days. Now, as you guys remember, with that last shutdown and some of the other shutdowns that have occurred, we got to see some rare and unique stuff that the government really hasn't done before. That's because they ran out of money in a big way, in a big way. Now, let's go through that so you understand. So now you understand you're not one of those people that's like, they'll always just pay it. It'll be paid on time. They don't always just pay it. In fact, the amount of time that they are closed down keeps growing and growing as we go farther into the future. Now, Republicans want a balanced budget. Democrats want to spend. The system collapses. And I want you to understand this. This is a very severe term. And they're even talking about this in the Treasury report. The system collapses if we pay and continue to pay by raising the debt ceiling, because the amount of money we make each year cannot pay for the amount of debt that we have to pay basically to all of our debtor or the people that have given us this money, right? So let's say that you take out a loan to buy a car, right? And all the money that you earn that month has to go to the car. Now, what happens if all the money you owe that month, instead of having to go basically to the car, let's say that it takes more than the money you earn that month to pay for that car. Well, then you lose the car because all the money you earn to pay it isn't enough. And that's what we're facing here. As a nation, our gross domestic product, it's not enough money to pay for our debt. Okay, cool. Now you understand it. So if we continue to pay it, right, if we continue to raise that ceiling, the whole system collapses. If we stop and don't allow that ceiling to go up, things don't get paid and the system collapses. So we're stuck in a unique, financial, horrific situation. Now, what happens when it shuts down is it shuts down in stages. There will be certain things where basically you'll start to see, certain aspects of the government being shut down. It could be something simple like the local field office isn't open. It could be something simple like they've, gone ahead and, closed down the national parks. Then all of a sudden we get into employees are no longer getting checks. Then we go into the employee benefits are being cut off. Then we start to get into a unique, interesting territory, which for Social Security benefits is a bit of a problem. Now, a lot of you guys don't understand because you think, okay, I paid my money, I'm set, everything's cool, money's there in an account with my name on it for me. But that's actually wrong. The money doesn't live in an account just for you. It doesn't. We know how much you paid in and stuff like that, but it doesn't just exist there for you. They go into these mega, ultra, gigasaurus trust funds, like, for example, the retirement trust fund or the retirement trust fund or the Medicare trust fund. So that money goes in, but whatever you paid in was already spent. It was already spent. It was spent on the prior generation. Okay. So basically, the millennials right now putting in a lot of money to pay for people who are already retired. That's how it works. So what you have to understand is that this idea, this notion, this thinking that you're paid in and you're set doesn't actually exist. You're paying in. It's a pyramid system, right? It's your classic Ponzi, yada yada. And then basically every generation thereafter pays for the prior generation. That's how it works. Now, the problem inherent with this that you're not thinking about, that I need your brain to start working on, is that the actual administration of the benefits, like who's paying for the staff, who's paying for essentially, all those little things that pay out, the programs when a program goes off or has a problem or you need to modify it, who's paying to upkeep the administration of those funds, right? So what happens is if the government somewhere around June has a major shutdown, then you're going to start to see a lot of these agencies starting to significantly restrict essentially their actions. Okay, we're going to do this, but we're not going to do this. We're going to do this, and then we're not going to do this. Then you're going to start to see, massive furloughs, right? You remember from that one before, like, employees weren't being paid, and then the government had to release, documents on essentially how these government employees should go ahead and ask for a deal from whoever they're renting from or their mortgage company or whatever. You know what I mean? Like stuff you would never expect from our backed by the federal government. And I think that's the most important part of this video. Like if I were just to pause right here and say, if you wanted to pay attention, this is the spot. It's to understand that to be backed by the federal government works for a small amount of money, right? For a small amount for if somebody stole something from a bank that's backed by the feds, right? But when we're talking about social security benefits or keeping entire agencies open, we're talking about big, big billions and even multiple trillions. And the problem is that the United States government can't actually back multiple trillions of dollars to go ahead and cover, in this case, the one we're interested in, social security benefits. And the whole reason this is important is that if your brain is sitting there going like, they'll just cover it, everything's fine, nothing's going to happen, then you have to ask yourself, if you pay this money in and it goes into a big trust fund that they're not supposed to touch, but for putting it into a bond market to try and get more money to come out of it, what happens to that money that's sitting there, that's paid in, that's supposed to go to benefits? Well, if they really, really need the money, they might start eyeing it. If they needed to go ahead and administer it, they'd look at it and say, well, guys, here's the bottom line. We're going to need our staff at the SSA to work with the IRS to go ahead and administer these funds. So you start to see that there's some wrinkles in the process of actually producing, where these funds are going to go, how these funds are going to be dispersed. So I need you to be aware of that because that's so crucial. Like understanding that fundamental point is absolutely crucial, and that the government doesn't have money to back you up. They only have the money that you paid in that's sitting in the trust funds. They don't have extra trillions that they're going to use on you because you are not that high of a priority, right? And let's just be fair about it. You could say you're a very high priority. You are a very high priority. But when it comes to military budget or this or that, things like that, I mean, look, if you look at how much the SSA has been getting for raises for staff and technology and things like that, they're not keeping up with the amount of people that they need to process. That's why one of the big things Biden did was he actually mass funded some of the things that the SSA needed so that they could get the staff that they needed. You should know because I've talked about applying to be an ALJ in one of those videos. Okay. Now, one of the problems inherent with this, one of the big problems is that a lot of people don't realize how tricky this situation is. Republicans are pushing for this agenda, this idea that they can balance this budget. And there's ways to balance the budget. Look, if you look at essentially ways that we can pull back from mass spending, it exists. But there's one thing that the government is not willing to do, because if it does this, it allows China and Russia and other major, entities, sovereign nations to take over massive areas of land. Now, think about this for a moment. Just take a moment, think about it. If we go ahead and pull out, right, we take our missiles and rockets and our NATO this and NATO that. If we take our stuff out of these other nations, because that's what this is, right? If you start pulling away funding for people who are in that country, right? You pull back the CIA, you pull back the FBI, you pull back the military. If you start pulling all those people back, then you start pulling the equipment back, right? What happens? Well, Russia, China, they have the capacity to take over places, lots of island nations, lots of European nations without, crazy difficulty if the United States doesn't add a lot of that muscle behind it. Yes, NATO will support with other NATO entities what's going on to try and bolster and keep Russia, from doing what it's doing with Ukraine. But start thinking about it. If we pull back, you're going to see essentially the Russian and Chinese, government style situation spreading to a lot of smaller nations. And then the problem becomes once they're in there, how much is it going to cost to remove them? That's something that a lot of people don't talk about on YouTube. That's something that I think is incredibly important to think about. So, for example, if you have China take over 3 or 4 more island nations, right? They take them over. Well, strategically, then they can have a much greater force in the Pacific because they now control those islands and control that entire side, which means that entire side becomes cut off because we can't access it. We can't access it with helicopters. We can't access it with ships. Our troops can't get in. Okay. Then it becomes a ballistic situation where that's all you can pretty much do. Just, go ahead and attack things because that's the only option. Now, there's also satellite options too, but, we don't see a lot of that stuff. Now, the other side of the coin is the Ukraine side. That's another cutoff location. You go more north, you look at those, countries there, there's potential problem there because they could take over those. One of the big things the U.S. is afraid of is losing territory on the map. And don't think they don't sit there with a big world map and go, okay, we control these borders, we control this and this and this. We have NATO forces here, we have a special base here, etc. So when they do their mathematical calculations, if you're wondering why this country is so expensive, it's because across the entire earth, we have military sites and we have, a lot of military equipment and we have a lot of military personnel because we are fighting this special, unique America First war. Now, with that said, in order to fight an America First war, there's not as much funds left over because wars are incredibly expensive. What we're going to go through in this video, now that you understand the basics of essentially this treasury situation, like there not being enough money, now that you understand that, we're going to take a look specifically on an article that Forbes did, which I think is really, really good. This article from Forbes, and I'll just give you the specific details from it. U.S. national debt surpasses $30 trillion. What this means for you. And this article is a little bit older. It was November 6, 2022, so not too long ago. We're talking a couple months. This was done by Corena Bailey. I think she did, by E. Napolitano, a contributor. I think they did a pretty good job. I'm going to skip to the parts where I think they're relevant to you so you kind of have a better understanding as to how this national debt is problematic. Okay. So I'll just read the intro. How could the national debt impact consumers? Congress is responsible for ensuring the government stays funded. But you might still be curious about the national debt and how it relates to the federal deficit. Here are 6 ways the rising national debt could potentially impact Americans. So let's go through the 6 ways. That way you have a fundamental understanding of how it works. Also, wow, BK Dan, $5. Isn't SSDI, thank you for the donation first off. Let me read the question. Isn't Social Security wasn't susceptible to government shutdowns as far as paying or not? So here's the kicker. The administration of those funds are more at risk than basically the output of those funds, because the funds you're already paying in and we're paying in. If the federal government shuts down, there's the potential of enough days passing where the actual administration of funds could become problematic. It's farther down the line. It's not like, let me give you an example. If you were to place Social Security benefits on like a scale, right, as to where, it shuts down and then somewhere over here this happens, somewhere here this happens, we're way down here. Social Security benefits are way down here when it comes to problem of actually administering them. But you're going to see first federal government benefits like, pensions or specialty benefits for people who work for the government. They even put in the Treasury report that there's the potential of those being cut off without a really big amount of time. It was a relatively short period of time. And what that is that's our first indicator, our first blip on the map before we get down here to Social Security benefits not being able to be properly processed. Remember, it's not just that the money's there, it's that the people who are basically working keep paying in, and the administration keeps handling the output of those funds. That's realistically what we're dealing with here. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, with that said, you're right, it's farther down the line. But just to go back to that prior detail here, 2018 to 2019, the government was shut down for 35 days. 35 days. How much? So basically, you had agencies affected. There were 380,000 employees furloughed. Just let that sink into your brain. Okay, 380,000 employees furloughed. Cost the government $5 billion. $5 billion, okay, to go ahead and take care of that mess that was created. So inherent with that, I need you to understand this is not as simple as we just fix this and then it's okay. You got to fix like 10 things to make this work, or you just increase the cap, right? The amount that we have that we can raise our limit to, and then we just magically create money, and then we go ahead and pay people. There's a lot of moving parts here. We're going to address a couple of them in here so you understand it better. Higher interest rates. When the government needs to borrow more, they'll need to increase yields on treasury bills, bonds, and other fixed income instruments to make those investments attractive to investors. And while this can translate into higher yields on savings accounts, it also means higher mortgage rates, making the housing market unaffordable to some Americans. Consumers will likely pay more interest on their credit cards and other loans as well, since those interest rates rise when the Fed raises interest rates too. So right there, just to solidify what they're saying, the problem that you're going to face is that a lot of Social Security recipients, right? A lot of retired, a lot of SSDI people, some SSI people, but a lot of those types have essentially credit card debt. Most people in America have credit card debt. It's part of the okay. It used to be a cultural thing where you would pay it off every month and you would never carry it, right? But now everybody has it. It's just people are suffering. The money's not there. But what they're saying is higher interest rates are coming. And that means you're going to have less money because they're going to take more money off of the money you've already borrowed. Next thing that we're going to go through is basically number 2, higher product prices. While America is grappling with paying more at the grocery store, the national debt at current levels could cause inflationary trends to continue. Okay? Increased treasury yields could make American business appear to be riskier investments abroad. Remember, don't just think about your grocery store. Don't just think about your local farms. Think about the things that the local farms have to buy that come from overseas. Think about the foreign investors spending money on local farms so that they can increase. And the local farms, they're not going to be increasing that much, but still it's a problem. All right. The more companies have to pay to keep their debts in good standing, the more pressure to increase product prices. Higher product prices mean higher revenues, which is how companies can pay their debt obligations. So in other words, what they're saying is the companies have to make more money to pay off the stuff that they need to make the products. So you get a raw product, it costs more to go ahead and get it to the final end game. In fact, it costs more usually to just get the end product. One of the weird things about America too is that America has significantly lost its base fundamentals on how this whole farming thing works, right? I mean, how many of you actually know how farming works? How many of you, maybe you know the name John Deere, right? Because it's a classic green tractor. But beyond that, I'm not certain. I don't know. You tell me in the comments section. Do you know? Do you know essentially if you know how a tractor works, how to start it, how to lift the bucket, how to use the point system in the back, how to go ahead and attach implements? I mean, do you know how to do that? And so, my thing is, and that's good. Arizona Raven said, I do, which is excellent. So the thing is this, a lot of people don't have an understanding of where their food comes from. So what this comes down to is people are just expecting like the stuff is going to be there on the shelves at Publix and Walmart and Whole Foods and whatever. But what happens when it's not? Think about that. We had a really, really crappy season for growing. So we're going to be seeing prices rising even more. This had nothing to do, a little bit to do with the whole COVID thing. A lot of it was to do with like the whole, how much water we were getting, what were the fires, stuff like that. But it just wasn't a good growing season. All right. Number 3, lower home prices. And as interest rates go up, Americans will likely qualify to borrow less since more of their payment each month goes to interest and less toward principal. Thus, buyers won't be able to afford as many homes as they would when interest rates are lower. This will place downward pressure on home prices, which can impact the equity of all homeowners. All right, so it made a couple points there. First off, people are going to be buying fewer homes. So for a lot of those people out there that are like, hey, I'm at this point where I want to buy my first loan, right? I want to be a first-time homeowner. Now is not the time, which means you're going to be spending a lot more money on rent, which, as we know, is basically just taking money and throwing it at somebody else's mortgage. That's basically what that is. Now, with that said, and this is important to understand, the bottom line here is that people rely on equity. I rely on equity to be able to do stuff myself, right? The equity of the firm, the equity of my house, the equity of my knowledge, my education, all that kind of stuff. when you take what is pretty much one of the largest equity options that a human being has, which is how much money they have into their house, right? Whether they paid it off or they paid a bunch of money into it, whatever, all of a sudden you've got a little problem. You've got a little issue. And the issue is they can't use that equity to continue to push America forward. And let me give you an idea here as to how this works. When you have to do a project, and this is, God, if I could simplify this whole thing, if you look at this as just projects, it makes much more sense. Let's say that you had to do a project. I don't care what it is, just come up with one. Guys, in the chat section, come up with a project, like working on a pool, working on whatever. Give me some projects here. What do we got? I see eggs are at $5.85 a dozen. Yeah, eggs are. I love the memes though. I love the memes. Give me all right, so let's say you want to do a solar project because Arizona Raven again popped up. That's what she put in for the project. All right, so you got to buy the panels, you got to buy the battery system, you got to buy the electrical wire, you got to hook it together, you got to get all the mounting gear for up on the top, you got to get your ladders, all that stuff. It's a project. Now, in order to do that, you're going to get a loan. You're going to get a loan against something though, right? Because they need collateral. What's the collateral against? Could be your home, could be your car, could be your job, what you're earning, whatever. But the point is, most people want to take that equity out of their house. Most people want to use that equity. And when you really kill your house's worth, right? And where I live on my street, where I'm at right now, it's like a triple black diamond ski slope down. Everything is crashing in the market. And it sucks because I was like, wow, look at what this house is worth. And now it went like this and the same equivalent, it's going like this, right? Okay, cool. So the bottom line here is that you have to understand that doing projects, having the money to do projects, if you take the number one thing that's worth the most in most people's lives and you reduce its worth for their ability to complete projects, then you screw up the economy because more people can't buy stuff. And if people aren't buying stuff, you guessed it, the economy doesn't grow. That's a problem because then everybody sits. The money sits in the bank account and people aren't spending, people aren't working. You're seeing it. Okay. Number 4, less to spend on other government initiatives. This is going to be a fun one. This is wow. Ryshock, $20. Thank you for the $20 donation. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for donating that. Yeah, guys. And here's the thing. I'm convinced at this point, this channel would be a lot more popular, but I'm also convinced that some of the ideas that I talk about are ideas that have to some degree been restricted because they don't want panic. They don't want trouble. They don't want people realizing what's actually happening. The moment you start to sit back and see how the stock market works when it comes to massive groups of people moving money in and out and how they can shape it, the moment you start to see how mega companies are buying houses, trying to get the best deal and then create this mega portfolio and then buy and sell them off as they need to so that other Americans can't really get in on it, can't be a part of it anymore. And that's what they were doing. That's what these different groups were doing. Like Zillow was one of them. They were buying essentially 10 houses, and the 10th house they would buy for more than market value, which would then push all the prices of the houses up, which would make it so that the average American could buy it even less. Going into this, once again, that means Americans can't tap into their big equity, which is paying their rent into a mortgage and having that money count towards something, which means essentially the destruction of the American dream. Nobody talks about that stuff. Nobody really goes into what it means to people. And the worst part of it is, who are selling off houses and are going to be selling off houses left and right in the not too distant future? You want to know? It's the retired and the disabled. That's going to be your big group that will be selling directly to essentially these mega corporations. And here's why. These individuals are going to have a hard time affording what's coming up. So they're going to have to offload. When they offload, right, they're going to find a price, somebody to come in, whatever. Now, look, the retired usually keep up their houses. They get them prepped. They get them looking good, all that stuff. And some of the mentally impaired, for the disabled side, they know to keep it up, get somebody to come in and clean it. But the physically disabled, or the combination of the physically disabled and mentally disabled, they don't have those same options. So what sucks is that their houses over a period of time, they get, they fall into disrepair. They just disrepair, and then they're not worth as much. And the sucky part of that is that if they don't have something like VA benefits to get specialty loans, they're basically stuck in this situation where They just have a degradation and they get less and less and less. And now these interest prices, they're way up. The interest rises. And then all of a sudden you have a problem of this person now can't find somebody to buy their house. You're starting to see how the people to people system, Americans buying from Americans, is just failing, right? That's what it is. It's failing. Now, put on top of that, you have international actors, which are literally, countries with companies that are quasi owned by those countries coming in and buying certain businesses and industries in America, like meat industries or farm industries or steel industries. So what you have is that those main companies, that which we rely on for fundamental raw materials, right? The base, right? The animals to make the food, the land to make the grown food, the structural steel or whatever that we use to build stuff with. A lot of them are getting purchased up by external organizations that are actually held by foreign nations outside of the United States, many of which are not friendly to the United States. And what's not good about that is the United States takes out a lot of loans from those. All right. Now, number 4, less to spend on other government initiatives. The more money the U.S. has to spend on meeting its debt obligations as interest rates increase, the less financial capacity it could have to fund programs focused on education, veterans benefits, and transportation. Now, you notice they didn't say Social Security benefits in there because remember, we talked about it. They're way down the line. They're way down the line on it hitting the fan. But once again, education, the future of our kids, veterans benefits, those who fought for this country, right? Those are on the chop block much sooner than the Social Security benefits. Transportation, keeping the roads up to date. I mean, how many of you have driven down the road and been like, wow, that road in particular was horrible? Well, imagine that road being on significantly more highways, more byways, more all over the place, okay? This breakdown of the 2019 federal budget from the Council of Foreign Relations shows how the budget pie is only so big, right? Because there's only so much money. So when one area increases, another one must decrease. So what they put here was 23% of the budget goes to Social Security benefits, okay? Medicare gets 15%. Medicaid gets 9%. Other grouping is 15%. Defense budget is 50%. Non-defense budget is 15%. And then basically our interest payments they have at 9%, $375 billion. Now, the problem with this is that when you actually look at the math of how much we make per year and the trillions and how much it costs, our obligations, right? So we have to pay so much for that car that we got a car, loan on, plus what we have to pay in debt, system fails. We don't rise the debt ceiling, it collapses. Number 5, national security issues. The higher the national debt becomes, the more the U.S. is seen as a global credit risk. Now, a lot of you guys have heard these other issues. We're now on number 5. Number 5 is one of the most serious. It's also one of the most difficult ones to understand, to conceive, to see, etc. But the bottom line is this, okay? Our global credit risk defines everything in this country. Remember how I was talking about just a moment ago, how people have houses and you have equity in your house and that house dictates what your capacity is to borrow money. It's like what your worth is as a human to banks, right? Okay, cool. Same gig right here. Same gig right here, except that house is the United States government. And the United States government's, equity is you. Doesn't sound fun, doesn't sound nice, but that's what it is. It's the land, the products that are produced, and putting it very, very simply, your work product. So when you're sitting there wondering, why doesn't the federal government really love the retired? Why doesn't the federal government really love the disabled? Because at the end of the day, they're not adding to the bottom line for more earnings that they can borrow against because this national, United States credit is what they're worried about. Now, the higher the national debt becomes, the more the U.S. is seen as a global credit risk, which means other nations won't want to lend money to us. Other nations won't want to use our national reserve currency. If you're not sure what a national reserve currency is, it's super simple. When countries go ahead and trade with each other, most of them use what's called the U.S. dollar because the U.S. dollar is established. They believe in it. They trust it. They got it, right? That's what they do. Russia owns U.S. dollars. China owns US dollars. All these countries, they use US dollars. Let's see. BK Dan, thank you for the $2 donation. Just said 31 trillion plus reasons why number 5 is so serious. Yeah, like BK Dan, that, like, guys, if you're wondering like what the most serious part is, the biggest cluster bleep, and I didn't say the word because the person will text me immediately about saying the word, but the bottom line is this is it. This is the big one that if we don't fix this, all of it collapses immediately too. It's not like a slow process. It's an immediate thing. So here's what's happening with the reserve currency problem. We have a significant amount of our dollars floating around because we are like the Bank of the US. And the US dollar, the more of it that's out there and the more of it that people believe in it, the more that people are using it, the better our dollar stands, right? The more our dollar is worth because people have more belief in it. Wow. And Scott, thank you for the $4.99 donation. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. That's absolutely amazing. That's really, really good. So the point here is what happens that's kind of shitty is that if we are not able to make other countries believe that we are an awesome country with with an income and a money that's never going to go out of business, right? They got to believe in us. They have to believe the United States is going to continue to go forward and just do what it does, business as usual, without a problem. But when you don't fund the government, what happens? People start to realize how fragile the United States government actually is. And that, my friends, sucks. Because if other countries stop using our US tender, then what they do is they take their reserve of US tender and buy somebody else's US tender with it, or they flood it into their market to give their citizens of that country those dollars, which is worse than printing money because it's faster than printing money, especially when it's just boom, that much money directly into the population. I mean, sure, we could just make up numbers in this country and that could be faster than that. But the bottom line is when you're talking big money and you're talking flooding the market, that's what they would do. Now, if you flood the market with US dollars, what happens? Well, what happens is you go ahead and have a problem where the US dollar significantly decreases over time. Right? That's it doesn't take much time, but it significantly decreases because there's too much dollar, not enough desire to have the dollar and keep the dollar, right? So the problem we're facing is if we don't have a good debt situation where people believe in our dollars, then we're not going to be able to back our bonds as well, and our bond ratings will drop. We're not going to be able to go ahead and have as much reserve currency being used by foreign nations. We're going to have a big problem. And it's not like this little thing that we're looking at right now, which is huge, but still compared to that, losing the international, number one currency for reserve currency use, the US dollar for that is by far the biggest problem we could potentially run into. So, and I love how they put in here, this could negatively impact the US's position as a global political, economic, and social power. That's their way of saying that the US as we know it would be redefined more so like a nation that just sits in its spot, right? It's in its borders, it does its thing, it does trade, but having bases all over the place, that's over. Having as much NATO influence, WHO influence, all that stuff, it's over. That would be over, okay? Which means that if a lot of that stuff is over, guess what? Russia starts to seep out into these other nations. China starts to seep out into these other nations. That's what happens. Number 6. Lower returns on your investments. Bonds issued by the Treasury are typically seen as low-risk investments. That's true. When interest rates rise, the yield on these low-risk investments also rises. That's good, okay? Making them more attractive investments for income-minded investors over other riskier income-generating investments like corporate bonds. So what we're saying here is this situation has the potential to go in one way, which could help the federal bond market. Could go another way, which would hurt it. But right now, it looks like it's going the way that will help the federal bond market. This could leave companies, I'm reading from it, that typically rely on bonds short on the loans they need to finance expansions and operations and translate into lower returns for equity investors when companies fail to meet revenue targets. All right, let's talk about this real quick. I need you to understand this. Remember how we talked about this idea of doing projects around your apartment, around your house, whatever? Same thing as when major companies have to essentially do projects. So they're bigger money, more people, more resources, same thing. So what does this mean? This means that the problem, the financial issue, is that if companies can't improve themselves, and that's why they're doing this project, they're trying to find a way to make more money, restabilize their position, take more of the, overall, existence of the marketplace, whatever. There's a pie, they're here, they want more, right? That's how these companies work. But if they can't do these things and they have to rely on bonds, then their ability to do bigger, quicker projects with scarier, investments paying out okay, well, those start to shrink down. They're stuck with bonds, which is leaving them an inability to do projects as easily as they would before, which it slows down the capacity of innovation for companies in America. Wow, thank you, BK Dan. Thank you for the $5 donation. So yeah, he said, in my opinion, this is what happens when we play Globocop and when we got off the gold standard in 1933. So yeah, obviously moving off the gold standard, that boat has sailed, it has sunk. We tried to pull it back up, we couldn't get it back. It was too heavy, and we left it in the ocean, right? And so that's what's happening here. The model that the United States had, which was really perfected directly after World War II, because remember, the U.S. and its soil wasn't all blown up from World War II. That was like the major thing that they don't teach in history class, which is like the fundamental economic aspect of World War II being so crucial. All Europe, Russia, all kinds of places, Japan, all places, they were all bombing. Africa, there was all this war, and the nations were torn, and the buildings were, you think there were a lot of windows? They added more windows to the buildings, right? Some of them crumbled. There was demolition. They had to remove all that demolition. They had to put it somewhere. It's expensive. So the point is, right, we, in our little America bubble, right, we're safe. And that's when we really started to take our place, our advantage. We also did in World War II get a lot of scientists, obviously from Germany, which, let's call it is. That doesn't hurt. When you're scientifically ahead of the curve with innovations for war, you're gonna go ahead. Even when you have your scientists and you grab the opposing party's scientists thereafter, and a lot of them live literally in my area. Their kids live in my area around NASA, right? They're great descendants and things like that. So the bottom line is, when you grab all that science, you're in a good spot. You're going to win because you're going to innovate. You're going to be ahead of the time. Now, which goes into what China is doing, which is they're actually buying places and setups, and the student gets everything they need from top universities for kids in science and sending them to their labs over there, which doesn't help either. So what causes the national debt to increase? This is from the article specifically on this. Sometimes the government needs to increase spending to stabilize the economy and protect Americans and businesses from unexpected economic conditions. COVID. During the Great Recession, December of 07 to June 09, for example, Congress passed legislation injecting $1.8 trillion into the economy, but that pales in comparison to the $4.5 trillion the Trump and Biden administration have pumped into the economy since the COVID pandemic began in March of 2020. However, there are other reasons the national debt increases even during years where spending is moderate and the economy is in good shape. What they're saying there is that don't be surprised if this really turns into a bad situation where the politicians can't agree. Don't be surprised if there is a new type of stimulus that's sent out to people. Inflation is going to be bad. Maybe not as bad as the ending of last year, but it's still going to be bad. So expect there to be some sort of problem that requires a corrective measure in the economy, not just the businesses, not just the federal government, but the American people. So don't be surprised if they start talking about these stimulus things again, because the likelihood that a stimulus will be needed to help Americans stabilize is going to be extremely high. Next one, tax cuts. On one hand, tax cuts can stimulate the economy and put more money in Americans' bank accounts every payday. But those same tax cuts means the federal government brings in less revenue across the board. For example, and remember how we talked about the human population is the blood that basically allows the government to have equity with foreign nations, which allows the U.S. government to borrow and borrow and borrow. We are the business. We are the business. They own us as employees and take from us so that they can get basically better loans from other entities, super wealthy people and countries. For example, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 slashed taxes for individuals and corporate payers, but created a $275 billion shortfall in revenue, even though the economy grew. The act caused revenue from corporate taxes to decrease by $135 billion, a 40% reduction from projected revenue. So when the government doesn't make as much revenue, do you think they can get as many, loans, right? So what happens? You go to buy a car, right? You go there, you show them what you're earning. The next month, you're earning less. They say, let me see what you're earning this month. You show them, they go, whoa, 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 whoa. You're not earning as much. You don't have continuity of payment that's consistent. It's a problem. So what happens then is all of a sudden, they don't want to give you that loan, or they want to reduce the potential of you to have that loan. So the bottom line is, we are the workers. We are the lifeblood that basically pays for the government to go ahead and get these loans. Rising healthcare costs. According to data from the nonpartisan Peter G. Peterson Foundation, per capita healthcare spending in the U.S. is three times higher than in comparable developed nations like the United Kingdom and France. So just to help you out, when all of you guys were like, yeah, let's have the government take over our healthcare. Yeah, that's a great idea. The Obama era stuff, right? That was absolutely moronic. You could have put pressure on the politicians to make them change healthcare without taking over the system, to reduce the prices, work on the whole costs of things, etc. You could have done that, but you didn't. What you did was you folded and said, government, take over this entire thing and really interact with it. You know what the problem is? The best part of it, the whole thing that they were promising didn't even happen, which was that everybody would be covered. And that didn't happen. They had to take that out after a couple of back and forths. Okay. So as America's population ages, more people enroll in Medicare, and older Americans typically require more care. This translates to the federal budget bearing the burden for rising healthcare costs. Now think about that for a moment. We've got a lot of old people becoming older. We got a lot of people going on Medicare. And Medicare is different than disability. Medicare is different than retirement. Medicare is based off of you paying a monthly payment once you are retired, once you are disabled. So like the weird thing about it is that it's not like retirement and disability benefits. Like if you had to keep paying for retirement while you were retired, that would kind of defeat the point of retirement, right? Wouldn't it? Yeah, it would. Even though they do get taxes out of you in certain situations, right? So if you got disability benefits and you had to keep paying money for disability benefits while you're receiving them, that kind of defeat the point of having disability benefits, right? Disability benefits, you can't work much or you can't work at all. It defeats the point. But for Medicare, a unique difference is that they require you to pay a monthly amount. Now, with that said, they do have a mathematical graph, a forecast of when Medicare will become too expensive for the person receiving the average SSDI or retirement benefit. I haven't done a video on that yet. I will be doing it in the future. Now, using the data from the Congressional Budget Office and the Office of Management and Budget, the Peter G. Peterson Foundation estimated that the government will pay a staggering $5.4 trillion in interest over the next 10 years. $5.4 trillion in interest over the next 10 years. So who's responsible? I'm reading this part directly from Forbes and this amazing article they did. Who's responsible for the current national debt? Every administration is. Every administration. Let's just go through the presidents real quick so you know what happened. Franklin D. Roosevelt is the nation's last four-term president. FDR helped, right, Americans weather an abundance of economic crisis. His presidency spanned the Great Depression, and his signature New Deal economic recovery package helped lift America out of a financial rock bottom. But the most significant increase in the national debt was the cost of World War II, which added roughly $186 billion to the national debt between 1942 and 1945. Now, $186 billion nowadays isn't that much money in comparison to some of these other problems we're facing. Congress added $236 billion to the national debt during FDR's terms, representing the increase of 1,048% of the debt. Ronald Reagan basically increased it 261%, $1.26 trillion. So during his administration, from $924.6 billion to $2.19 trillion. Barack Obama increased the deficit by 74%, 8.6 trillion to the national debt during Obama's 2 years. Donald Trump, let's see what he did. Okay, so he had here, let's see. While the Treasury Secretary estimated that the tax cuts would decrease the federal benefit, the deficit increased from $665 billion in 2017 to $3.13 trillion in 2020. They don't give a percentage analysis, but let's see. Federal debt held by the public increased from $14.6 trillion in 2017 to over $21 trillion in 2020. And we don't have one for Biden. That's the reality. We don't know where this thing is going to go. Now, Biden has some good things going his way, which was, the war that was stopped. That financially helps him significantly. Let's talk about basically what is going to happen coming up. I'll read directly from their title to it. Are we helpless when it comes to the national debt? Right? Is there anything we can do? Is there any hope? Is there any potential here? BK Dan, $5 donation. He said, unfortunate predictions, yes, a stimulus, but they'll slip in a small national sales tax and sell it to us as not affecting for 2 or 3 years. Yeah, probably. Whenever these stimulus payments come our way, somebody's got to pay for it. And it's usually spread out over a 2 to 3 year principle where they basically go ahead and get it back some way, somehow, usually through taxes. Are we helpless when it comes to national debt? So basically, in some ways, and the article says in some ways, yes, but there are actions you can take to mitigate the effect of the national debt on your life. Thing number one, they say, this is from Forbes, pay your taxes. According to the IRS, the federal government loses $1 trillion each year due to unpaid taxes. Number two, put pressure on your congressional reps, call or write them, increase funding for the IRS to track down tax cheats and closing loopholes that give the country's most profitable companies tax bills that are lower than most Americans. And that's the truth. These mega companies, the reserve for like the billion companies, they have everything set up so they get all the loopholes, look, if they paid their actual taxes in this country, their first response, their first defense in a legal sense is, hey, they did everything legally. And that's true. That's true. But we don't live in an America that's abundant right now. We live in America that is scratching to get money and about to run out and shut down the government. That's where we're at. Next one, follow your reps' voting history. So this is a really good point. You should look at, and if you, the ironic thing is if you did this, you would have not voted for most of the people that are in there right now, including the president. Follow your reps' voting history. If you're curious how representative senators have voted on fiscal policy issues, that's easy to check. You can use voting history to back up your concerns when writing or calling your reps. Final one, learn about healthcare reform. While national healthcare remains a contentious topic, it could pay to learn how other countries control healthcare costs and how those policies could benefit you, your neighbors, and the impact rising healthcare costs has on the national debt. Now, I want to go through something real quick. When it comes to healthcare costs, when the government has to step in on an industry, it means that industry has completely lost its capacity to do what it's supposed to do. Happened in Miami with the legal industry, right? They had to send the FBI in to basically investigate judges and attorneys and, county people and all that stuff to get it back on track. That's what happened during the Obama era. But you never really want to go in that route for medical health care. And here's why. When you have a problem, it's much harder to sue the government who helped with organizing the systems that are in place now that you have to follow. And also the government can be, and it depends on which industry, anywhere from 4 to 10 times less efficient when actually processing things. They're just not as efficient as the private market, which is why we usually want the government to stand back and hold those companies accountable for what they're supposed to produce, how they're supposed to distribute it, and how they're supposed to warranty, right? Something goes wrong, they got to deal with it. That's a lot of knowledge that I've given you there. But the bottom line fundamental is that a really scary time is coming up. So if you're wondering, how are we going to pay for all that COVID stimulus that just went out there? We'll be paying for it through a lot of different means and a lot of different ways. Is the inflation going to get significantly better? No. It might get a little bit better, but not significantly better. If we're talking 8.7 that you saw for a cost of living adjustment, probably down to a 4.55 throughout the 2023 season. Okay. Now, with that said, you have to keep in mind our number one tactic is to keep other countries and other major investors believing that we are a good investment, that our employees are doing their jobs and creating work product. If they don't believe in us, the thing collapses. Okay. And finally, at the end of the day, the thing about it is that Social Security benefits have protections. We're going to do a whole video specifically on the protections that they have, but they're still on the timeline. Do not think for one moment that when you look at when a government shuts down, that Social Security benefits and the distribution of those funds are safe. There's a lot of problems. One agency might shut down that the SSA needs to communicate with. One grouping of the SSA's areas may shut down, and then we can't get something processed through because we need something fixed before it can be processed. Employees aren't being paid. Employees need time to go ahead and complete things and aren't getting the proper benefits that they don't really get to have days off. Just start to realize there's a problem here. And they're talking about 2011 standards for money that's needed, which was a big one. What happened when Trump was in? The government shut down longer. Now, the reason this happens is that the Republicans tend to be financially a lot, let's just say, they spend the money more appropriately. The Democrats, I don't know if you've really looked at what Biden was pushing through, but that is spending money left and right. That is mass spending, and there's not enough control at the county, states, the Senate, the House. There's not enough control there as to where all this money is going, which is where we get into the slush fund problem of, did we just release billions to something that was way too easy to release billions on, which, as you know, is what a lot of people are angry about right now. A lot of people are not very happy about the Ukraine situation. So my point to you is basically this. We have to, as a country, figure out a way to balance our budget. But if we don't raise it, the thing collapses. And if we don't find a way to balance it at some point in the very near future, the whole thing collapses. So that's what's scary about this situation. That's the problem we face. And, gauge it. And I'll do a video specifically on what are the stages of a government shutdown, who loses what benefits are lost first. When do we get to the point where they're taking the handles off of the water fountains at the at the national parks, which happened, which genuinely did happen. So anyways, guys, I will catch you a little bit later. I hope you have an absolutely wonderful day. I'm going to be doing another 2 videos after this, and then we will go from there. All right, I'll catch you a little bit later, and thank you so much. Please remember to like, subscribe, and leave 5-star reviews. I'll put it in the chat section and also in the comment section after this video. Thanks so much. I'll catch you later, guys. Bye-bye.